Helm Hammerhand is one of Rohan's most beloved figures. He was the legendary king who led Rohan through some of its darkest days, a hero to his own people, a brutal, almost mythical monster to his enemies. Even 250 years after his death, the horn of Helm Hammerhand was enough to freeze the hearts of Rohan's foes. But sometimes reality gets lost in the labyrinth of myths and legends, so in this video, let's take an objective look at Helm Hammerhand and let's determine the truth. Was he truly a legend worth admiring, or was he a moron? If you pay attention to any Lord of the Rings related media, you've probably heard of the War of the Rohirrim, an animation by New Line Cinema set for release in 2024. On the 16th of June, New Line put out some concept art showing what appears to be Helm Hammerhand standing before the gates of the Hornburg. This isn't the first time Helm Hammerhand has appeared in an adaptation. He infamously appeared in Shadow of War, where he would become one of the Nazgul, which is completely lore accurate provided you repeatedly dive headfirst into a brick wall. What this tells us is that Helm Hammerhand, despite being a guy who only had a few paragraphs written about him, is reasonably popular within the community. The main reason for this is fairly obvious. His name is Helm Hammerhand, and Hammerhand is an amazing nickname. It's probably one of the best in the entire Legendarium. Only some of Turin's nicknames compete, but Turin gave himself like 10 names, so it's kind of cheating, and also some of his names were kind of cringy, so he loses points for that. Helm earned this name by commonly using his fists to kill his foes, brought on by a strange belief he had that if he didn't wield a weapon, in turn, no weapon would harm him. Before we go over the events that made Helm famous, we have to understand a bit of Rohan's history, mainly its history with the Dunlendings. Before Rohan was a nation, it was Calanadon, a province of Gondor. After the Great Plague of the 17th century, Calanadon's population began to dwindle, and the watch on its western frontier relaxed. This allowed Dunlendings to gradually cross the Isen and settle in the western parts of Calanadon practically unopposed. This was of little importance to Gondor. Their main focus was in the east, and the Dunlendings mostly left them alone. But after the Battle of the Fields of Celebrant in 2510, Calanadon was given to the Aethiod, who would become the Rohirrim. For the first 50 years of Rohan's existence, they would focus on securing their eastern borders against the remnants of the Balkoff Easterlings, but under the third king, Aldor, they would turn their attention towards the Dunlendings. The Rohirrim viewed the Dunlendings as illegal occupiers of their gifted lands, and the Dunlendings viewed the Rohirrim as northern invaders. Conflict was inevitable, and the Dunlendings were either driven out or subdued by the year 2645. This was only a temporary peace. By the time of the reign of Daor, which began in 2699, the Dunlendings were steadily drifting back into Rohan's western reaches. Daor led an army beyond the Isen in 2710, and defeated the force of Dunlendings near to Isengard, but was shocked to find that Isengard itself was in Dunlending hands, its formerly Gondorian garrison having been absorbed. Daor requested Gondor send help to besiege Isengard, but Gondor was busy fighting orcs from Mordor at that point. Daor was forced to withdraw, and with Isengard in Dunlending hands, the Dunlendings could enter Rohan without having to cross the fords of Isen. This brings us to the beginning of the story of Helm. Born in 2691, he would become the 9th king of Rohan in 2741. During his reign, a man named Freca grew to prominence in the West March, Rohan's westernmost region. Freca was nominally a vassal of Helm's, but was highly independent and a thorn in Helm's side. He had a fortress at the source of the River Adorn, and controlled much territory on either side of the river. He claimed to be a descendant of King Freowine, the 5th king of Rohan, but it was clear he had plenty of Dunlendish blood, given he had dark hair. Many Westmarchers were the same, being of mixed Rohirric Dunlendish descent. One of the most famous events in Rohan's history occurs in 2754. Freca shows up to a council meeting, which was a rarity. He asks for the hand of Helm's daughter for his son, Wolf, but Helm declines and instead makes a joke about Freca being fat. Those in attendance laugh, which humiliates Freca, who falls into a rage and threatens Helm. Helm waves it off and says they can talk later after the council meeting is finished. After the council, Helm asks for Freca to follow him outside Edoras where they can talk privately, much to the discomfort of Freca's men. They are correct to be alarmed. Without letting Freca speak, Helm tells him he's sick of his insolence and punches him in the head, which actually ends up killing him. I guess that's why they call him Hammerhand. Immediately afterwards, Helm declares Wulf and Freca's other kinsmen to be enemies, and they flee from their holdings when Helm sends his riders into the Westmarch. The next major chapter in Helm's story is a dreary one, and it occurs in 2758, 4 years after Freca's death. Sometime in the middle of that year, Easterlings invade Rohan from across the Anduin. At the same time, 3 fleets of corsairs attack the length of Gondor's coast, tying up the bulk of its forces. This was clearly a coordinated effort by the enemies of Gondor and Rohan, and it gets even worse. Seeing their opportunity, an army of Dunlendings led by none other than Wulf invades from the west, and they're joined by corsairs who landed at the mouths of the Eisen and the Leftnui. Somehow, Wulf had struck an alliance with Umbar. This is all too much for Rohan. Helm can't defend from both the Easterlings and the Dunlendings at the same time. He attempts to hold the fords of Eisen, but he's defeated and driven into the Hornburg where he is besieged. Rohan is overrun, and its people flee into the valleys of the White Mountains. Wulf captures Edoras and declares himself king. Halef, Helm's eldest son and heir, is killed during its defense. With Gondor busy fighting the Corsairs, it looks like Rohan is finished. However, the winter strikes early and hard. Snow is rare in Rohan, but in November it begins to fall, and it doesn't stop until March the following year. This is an event known as the Long Winter, a deadly time for the people of Rohan and Eriador. By January, the Hornburg's food stocks have run out, and starvation begins setting in. Helm's second son, Harmer, alongside a company of men, sally forth to find food, but are never seen again. Suffering from starvation and grief, Helm seems to go kind of insane, and as the legend goes, he begins to set out alone from the Hornburg, blasting his horn to signal his departure, dressed completely in white and armed with nothing but his bare hands. He would go into the snow-covered camps of the Dunlendings and slay anyone he could find, and according to the Dunlendings, he would eat the dead if he could find no other food. This tactic is so effective that whenever the Dunlendings would hear the blast of Helm's horn, they would flee in terror down the valley. This continues until the final days of winter, but on one of those nights, Helm does not return. In the morning, they find him frozen dead atop the dike outside the Hornburg, standing upright with his knees unbent. He was unconquered till the very end. It was no enemy of Rohan who slew him, but nature itself. When the winter breaks, Freolaf, Helm's nephew, takes a company of desperate men to Edoras, and there they manage to surprise Wulf and kill him. When the snows melt, the river Entwash floods, and the Easterlings either drown or are forced to withdraw back across the Anduin. Having finally dealt with the Corsairs, Gondor finally sends help to Rohan, and by the end of the year, they are able to free Rohan from the Dunlendings and even retake Isengard, which is soon given to Saruman. Although ultimately victorious, Rohan was devastated by the war and the subsequent winter, and they would not recover to their old strength until the reign of King Folkwyne, over 100 years later. So the story of Helm is a bit of personal heroism mixed into a dark time where terrible tragedies take place. At first glance, it seems kind of odd that the Rohirrim would remember Helm so fondly. I mean, as we've just went over, his was a reign where Rohan was invaded by 3 different enemies, defeated and humiliated. Their lands were overrun, their people were forced to hide in the mountains, and in the brutal winter that followed, they suffered huge losses in people, horses, and cattle due to starvation, fighting, sickness, exposure, grief, you name it. Very obviously not a good time. You can't blame Helm for some of these events and outcomes. He can't control the weather, and the Easterling invasion was clearly part of a pre-planned, coordinated strike. However, his actions when it came to Freca certainly made the situation much worse than it needed to be. While I'm not going to claim that Freca didn't have it coming, when dealing with a powerful vassal, you can't just kill them and expect the problem to go away. Even though he seems to have seized Freca's land and effectively exiled his family, it clearly wasn't enough. What one must remember is that Freca wasn't just an unruly vassal. He was a man with very clear and strong links to Dunland. Remember, he had clear Dunlandish blood, and he controlled lands south of the Adorn, lands traditionally outside of Rohan's control. In other words, he had a power base that extended beyond Rohan itself. Also, he was clearly remembered quite fondly by his people. During the War of the Ring, 250 years later, many Westmarchers actually sided with Saruman, having not forgotten Helm murdering their old lord. It's also clear that Helm underestimated Wulf. Although we don't know much about him, his actions speak well enough for him. He managed to strike a bargain with the Corsairs of Umbar. He organised an invading army, defeated Helm in battle, and then seized his capital. So he seemed like quite a capable individual, and a capable individual with a justified vendetta is a very dangerous person to underestimate. If Helm truly wanted to squash the threat, he should have made a stronger effort to kill or capture Wulf along with his close family after he killed Freca. So by killing Freca in such a callous manner, Helm basically guaranteed a war between Dunland and Rohan. Instead of being proactive, he allowed his enemies to build up their forces out of view, and when they had an opportune time, they struck with great effect. Helm also ensured disloyalty in the West March for generations to come. Now, that's not to say none of this might have happened had Helm not killed Freca. It's very possible Freca might have turned traitor when the Easterlings invaded, but better a possibility than a certainty, right? During the war, Helm's performance is also quite poor from what little we know. We don't know how the Rohirrim combated the Easterlings, but when it came to the Dunlendings, Helm was soundly defeated. He attempted to hold the fords of Isen, despite the fact that Dunlending control of Isengard meant the fords were now useless as a defensive position as enemy forces could come down both sides of the river. To be fair to Helm, the Rohirrim don't seem to be the best at learning. 250 years later, Theodred and Grimbold would employ the exact same tactic and would also be defeated. Rohan's defeat at the hands of the Dunlendings is also a big deal and kind of out of character. Dunlendings were poorly armed, poorly equipped, and lacked horses. In contrast, the Rohirrim had weapons and armour forged in Gondor, and they had plenty of horses. So either Wulf was a military genius, Helm was a complete idiot, or perhaps the Corsairs of Umbar had a big enough presence to give the Dunlendings the advantage. While Helm's actions during the siege of the Hornburg were both heroic and impressive, they were also largely unimportant in the context of the Greater War. Sure, they may have inspired the defenders of the Hornburg and helped ensure their safety, but when Helm died, Rohan was still firmly in enemy hands. It was Freolaf who led the daring attack that would retake the capital and kill Wulf. It was Gondor who provided the much-needed manpower to free the kingdom, and rather ironically, it was the long winter itself that would be the biggest obstacle against Rohan's invaders. It affected them just as equally as it did the Rohirrim. So apart from providing a great story, why is Helm so revered by the Rohirrim? The end of his reign was a time of great death and hardship. He was a terrible diplomat. He was defeated soundly in the one war that he fought. Really, all he had going for him was that he was an excellent warrior with an awesome name. The answer was actually in the question itself. Helm is so revered because he did provide a great story. He provided a legend. One should never underestimate the value of a good story. Even in our modern world, nations take great pride in their greatest stories. The stories your nation has helps to build its identity, and it's identity that keeps a nation strong. For my own country of Australia, one of our greatest stories is Stephen Bradbury. If you haven't heard of Stephen Bradbury, look him up. It's both amazing and hilarious. The point is, the Rohirrim don't write down their history. They tell it through oral stories, and they weave it in bright and colourful tapestries. They don't have historians combing through the fine details because they don't have any books. If you want to learn history, you learn it from the bards and minstrels. And the bards and minstrels will tell the stories worth telling. Everything else kind of gets forgotten. In the case of Helm, the story isn't about not killing your vassals, or watching as your country is invaded and nearly destroyed. It's about a lone hero going out to fight even though his nation is on its knees. The story is about Helm being a symbol of defiance, and that defiance allowing Rohan to survive to a brighter day even when all seemed lost. These are the stories that the Rohirrim want to hear. They are a warlike people, bold and brave and proud, and those are the traits they admire the most. The importance of Helm as a symbol of defiance cannot be understated. When Isengard invades Rohan during the War of the Ring, Theoden retreats to Helm's Deep, believing he could weather the storm there just as Helm did 250 years earlier. Before the battle, Theoden wishes Erkenbrand were with him, favourably comparing him to Helm Hammerhand. During the battle, the defenders of the keep refer to themselves as the Helmingers, and they invoke Helm's name before they charge into battle. When the horns of Rohan's reinforcements sound in the hills, those who charge with Theoden shout that Helm has arisen and is coming to save them. And we even see the effect Helm had upon the Dunlendings. Generations later, when the sound of Helm's horn echoes throughout the hills, the Dunlendings and all the foes of Rohan freeze in terror, because just as the Rohirrim speak of the story of Helm in pride, the Dunlendings speak of it in fear. So in reality, from what we know of his history, Helm Hammerhand probably wasn't one of the better kings of Rohan. In all actuality, when you weigh up his decisions, and what happened to Rohan during his reign, and the impact that it would have, he was probably one of the worst kings. But for the Rohirrim, the most important part of Helm's reign was the final few weeks, when he would stalk the camps of his enemies by himself, slaying them one by one, and making them know fear. In that way, he embodied Rohan's greatest virtues: a proud king, a bold warrior, and a brave defender. That's the part that made it into a story, and that's a story that still inspired the Rohirrim hundreds of years later. That's the funny thing about history. It's never quite simple, and many things can be true. Helm was a legendary hero, but he was probably also a legendary fool. He was a fantastic leader in the sense that he was decisive and led from the front, but a terrible leader in the sense that he was brash and short-sighted. His actions doomed many, but probably saved many others, in both his lifetime and in many lifetimes to come. And amidst Rohan's darkest days, he managed to conjure up one of its finest hours. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting. It's not often I do character studies, but I have to say that after I saw the concept art for War of the Rohirrim, I had to do a video on Helm, largely because he's a truly bizarre character, and I thought his representation wasn't entirely accurate when compared to his actions. As someone in my livestream said the other day, Helm was more of a guerrilla chieftain than a king. If you want to know more about the Long Winter, I did a video on it in my War in Middle-earth series. Cheers, thanks again, and remember, Helm was bashing people to death aged 68, proving that old man strength is canon in Middle-earth.